Welcome to Feminist Question Time, brought to you by Women's Declaration International, the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We actually are radical feminists, many of us, the epitome of TERFs, and the targeted opponent of gender identity proponents. Our analysis of gender identity ideology has been consistent since Jane Raymond's The Transsexual Empire book in 1979, which means that we've been fighting this for 45 years. We were not surprised when this new attack on women came along, and we have not changed our analysis. In 2018, we wrote a declaration on women's sex-based rights, which lays out our position, and it has been signed by 38,640 people from 160 countries, and it's supported by 540 organizations. We have volunteer activists, including country contacts from every continent. Please join us. You can also become a member of WDDI to help our work by volunteering or donating. You can contact us at info@womensdeclaration.com or via your country contact on the website. Our program today is Professor Dr. Eva Rieger from Germany and Samantha Brown from Canada. Eva Rieger is going to talk to us about the problems at the Society of Musicological Studies in Germany. And Samantha Brown will explain what's happening with the Bill C-63 in Canada. We're going to hear from Dr. Eva Rieger. She's a German musicologist, but she will also introduce herself in her talk. So welcome, Eva. Delighted to have you here with us, and over to you.
My name is Eva Rieger. I was just a couple of words to myself, as this is the first time I'm speaking here. I was born on the Isle of Man in 1940 during the war, and I'm often asked, good heavens, why the Isle of Man of all places? My father, Julius Rieger, was a German pastor who got a job in 1930 in London as a pastor of the German congregation there. And when Britain declared, he went there in 1930 because unemployment was quite spread in Germany. But when Britain declared war with the Nazis, Prime Minister Churchill had to get rid of all German citizens living in the UK, and he said the famous sentence, "Collar the lot." My parents were sent to the Isle of Man, and the men moved into camps, and my mother was pregnant with me, and together with 3 siblings, she was put into a hotel, and I was born there in a luxury prison, so to say. We moved to Berlin in 1953, so I have both passports. I studied musicology, and in 1976, I visited the first conference with women students at the Free University of Berlin, which they had hosted on their own. They said that the men should look after the children, and it was a woman-only achievement. It was called Frauen und Wissenschaft, and they did a book on it. Let's show it to you, the top, Frauen und Wissenschaft, Women and Academia. And here you see some of the women who were listening. It was absolutely full, and I was very enthusiastic. These women were now in the 70s, as I am now in the 80s. And we were stunned to hear on this conference in 1976 what so many women had achieved in the past as authors, as musicians, and so on. And I asked well, not as musicians, they weren't mentioned at all, because I asked myself, how is the situation for women in music? I only knew at the time that the composer Mendelssohn, Felix Mendelssohn, had a sister, and that she had perhaps written something. So I went to the archive, and I said to the man who was looking after it, to the boss, I said, "Have you got any music by Fanny and Mendelssohn?" And he said, "Oh yes, an American was there yesterday. It's still on the chair." And there was a pile of papers, of yellow papers, on the chair. He let me touch them without gloves. He wasn't bothered at all. And I leafed through them, and I saw a string quartet, an overture, over 100 songs, piano pieces. I was absolutely amazed. And later on, I found a book on Clara Schumann, the wife of Robert Schumann, the composer, and saw that she had composed quite a bit, but did not dare to show it to others or to have it at all performed. And so this was, of course, the initiative for me to work immediately on a book. And the first one was called Frau, Musik und Männerherrschaft, Women, Music and Male Domination in 1980. So I can be proud to have been the first person who attempted to attack the subject. The third edition was printed in 2021. Anyway, I followed with Frau und Musik. This is a collection of all sorts of essays and letters from women of the 19th century who had tried to compose or had tried to work as musicians and had always been in trouble or had not managed it. And that followed a year later. And so I was really in the subject now, and I realized it was something ever so expensive. What I really enjoyed writing, perhaps I can just add that, and then I don't want to show off so much. What I really enjoyed writing was a book on the films of Alfred Hitchcock, where I analyzed the music of the way music described women and the way music described men. That was this one here. And the nicest thing about this book was that I could always tell my colleagues I'm working on academia, and at the same time I was looking at the TV and had a lot of fun with that book. So now, Eva Rieger, stop showing off and get on with it. So I'm going to get on with it now, and I would like to summarize what happened to me last December in Cologne. Oh dear, I've still got 2 English books. Just show you that. I just see that. That's one, and the other one in English is one on Richard Wagner's wife, Minna Wagner. So that enough of that. I would like now to summarize what happened to me last September in Cologne, as a few weeks ago, at the annual meeting of the Society for Research in Musicology, and how absurd the shouting was when I gave my presentation, as large parts of the audience, consisting of 60 to 70 people, quite a lot of them still students, probably believed, or what I think had been told, that I was transphobic, which of course I am not. I don't have to mention that. I had decided to talk about the problems which ensue, especially for women, when ideas of dissolving the gender roles pop up. This is the question of non-binary, being not non-binary or changing sex is very popular nowadays. I was careful to quote from others, first of all of them well-known women professors in German universities. After having read the first few pages of my presentation, a woman stood up and shouted, "Stop! Hören Sie auf!" It was horrible. Shut up, practically. Just standing up in the middle of an academic talk. I was absolutely shocked, but I said, "Listen, you can ask your questions when I finish. It's only 4 pages. And I'm on the second one," so she sat down again. At the end, it got loud, and the moderator stopped the discussion at a very early stage. I felt I could not defend my opinion. I was open to all arguments. I was waiting for them to come with their arguments and would have liked to discuss things with them for longer. I therefore combine this report with a request to each and every one of you listening to me today to fight for freedom of discussion at your university or wherever you are, and not to accept that you are silenced, in this case through protests, as that is now happening with the cancel culture at home and abroad. I just recall what the author J.K. Rowling, Kathleen Stock, and many others had to go through when they campaigned for women's rights on this issue. Anyway, one day before my presentation, I had been told that I had been proposed to become an honorary member of the Society for Research in Musicology, and that after approval by its advisory board, I would be honored with a laudation at the general meeting. I was, of course, very surprised and happy at this. I am certainly not one of the best intellectually. I want to make that clear. There are others which are much better. I was probably chosen because I was the first to point out the situation of women in musicology and in social reality. In my thanks for this honor, I would have openly pointed out that I was just the first stone to fall into the water, but the waves were picked up by many women who had already devoted themselves to the topic, Beatrix Borchardt, Susanne Rode-Breimann, and others, and so the honor also belonged to them. But things turned out differently. After the outcry at my presentation, I realized that a public award could be embarrassing for the society when I walked to the stage, because there would certainly be boos and noise from some in the audience. I did not want to put the society through that. It was embarrassing. So I sent my presentation as a mail to the president of the institution and offered to resign, which she accepted, surely with relief. She probably did not have the nerve to go through with the award and to stand up for freedom of discussion if protests ensue. Perhaps she discussed this with her board and they decided to turn me down. I don't know. I do not need an award, but it would have been a signal to the mostly male colleagues who have, many of them, disparaged sex and gender research for decades. With this honor, one could show them how important it had been to discuss the subject of women and music. Many colleagues, male colleagues, had ignored women's and gender studies for years and continued to analyze the Middle Ages, the work of male composers, etc. No comment, just silence. On the other hand, over the years, women have repeatedly told me that the book, Women, Music and Male Dominance, had changed their way of thinking. This opportunity has now been missed to the detriment of everyone who participates in gender research in music. I can add that I am used to this sort of behavior, as I experienced the same kind of situation 50 years ago. This has nothing to do with music, but I just want to add it. Having just been employed as a research assistant at the Berlin Academy of Music, this is 50 years ago, I took part in a TV documentary which, for the first time in television, was about the problems of lesbian women. A group of us were asked to talk about the subject, a sensation at the time. The evening before the film was broadcast, we women who had taken part in the film were, of course, pretty much scared. And we held hands and swore to help one another if anything awful happened. Some university employees who then saw it on television recognized me and were outraged that I had taken part. My father, a pastor, said, "Homosexuality is an illness." And the director, I said, "I don't feel ill." And he said, "There are illnesses which one don't feel." So how could I give an argument to that? And the director of the Berlin Philharmonic Choir, where I was a member, said that if there were any complaints, I would have to leave the choir, which happily did not happen. But the day after the film was broadcast, my professor, Dr. Gerhard Kirchner, shook my hand and congratulated me. A gesture of sincerity that I will never forget, because I was naturally afraid of contempt and criticism. I am just telling you this old experience because I find it vital to hold together when someone is attacked. I did not so much need comfort, but I needed solidarity. Back to the present. My approach is that together with many feminists, there is a biological difference between men and women, not in order to make biology a social destiny, but to emphasize that biology does not determine anything social. It is naive to believe that gender inequality will disappear if the sexes are dissolved. The danger is that the dissolution would destroy many rights for women which they had fought for. There has been a biological binary since the creation of humanity, which is organized hierarchically in patriarchy. You know all this, I'm just trying to get back to the subject. The concept of sex must be separated from that of gender. I have been trying for 46 years to show the inequality in the field of music so that it ends, but it is still present everywhere. One example, music that was used to describe traditionally female and male characteristics and has been established in the theory of emotions since the 18th century is still used in film music. Men are described upwards, with trumpets and so on, and the women used to get, it has changed now quite a bit, but in all the old-fashioned films, you'll find them with da 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 dee da da, all the feelings and emotions go into the women, and all the activity and the primal role goes to the men. It's most annoying, but you have to make it clear with students and with pupils so that they learn from it. It has by no means been abolished, but continues to influence us unconsciously. I named quite a lot of examples in my book on the music to Hitchcock's films. And I think there will never be a total freedom of gender roles. In short, woman as the female gender is a structural category in the patriarchy that is ideologically linked to the nature of women as biologically female beings, meaning sex. The definition and appropriation of what they think womanhood is distorts what it means to be really a woman and to be oppressed or murdered, femicides, because of this single fact. Trans people are not discriminated because of their gender, but because of their gender identity. For women, it is exactly the opposite. I would like to give a short summary of what I talked about when giving my paper. I began with quoting a colleague who claims that the binary gender order is a disorder as it serves primarily as an instrument of power. I disagree, and quoted 4 other colleagues, all German women professors. One of them is Tove Zeuland, who claims that the theory of sexual difference is superior to the gender approach because in the latter case, this would not lead to a more egalitarian gender relationship. On the contrary, men would remain dominant. I next quoted Hilge Landwehr, professor at the Free University of Berlin, who writes, "Experience is necessarily physical." This is a quotation. "There is currently no way for us to get rid of gender because the term is a crucial part of the abstraction basis of our culture. It will not disappear by simply ignoring it because it is fundamental to many other categories of social order. And finally, as we know, it is closely linked to the juxtaposition of matter and spirit, as well as to all the well-known dual concepts that build on it." And she closes with the following: "Perhaps in the distant future, we will be able to do without the term gender, but what we will certainly never get rid of is the physical affective concern." For Cornelia Klinger, a professor in Tübingen, individual gender identity is not just a social construction, but much more. She emphasizes that social reality is structured and shaped by gender difference, and that the category of gender is a conditional structural feature of modern society. She praises the cultural term, which opened the way for feminist theory to move from society to culture, and thus to the broad fields of thought, knowledge, meaning, and representation systems. Women should get involved, whether it is film analysis, religious criticism, or anything else. Women should get involved and change the culture so that they can participate on an equal footing. Marvelous, I can just applaud that. That is the task. For her, catching up is the main subject at the moment. The feminist philosopher Luz Irigaray, she's not a professor here, but a very, very well-known philosopher, also shows that the accusation of essentialism or biologism on the subject of sexual difference is untenable. It has become increasingly clear that Butler's deconstruction theory cannot break the long tradition of the male-connotated subject position, and that the dissolution of gender roles would destroy many rights for women which they have fought for. So this was the paper. I was talking about these these quotations, and I added something of my own. This was my paper which caused such a row and robbed me of my status of being honored. And then something else happened because, besides this, my female musicologist colleagues who are members of the Musicological Society have an internet list where one can write messages called Music and Gender, Mugi Gender, where we can exchange our opinions. I am also a member, of course, but when I started to discuss the theme of gender identification, they suddenly decided to censor the messages coming in, and mine were no longer sent. It became clear that they were censoring my contributions, meaning that they simply choose not to pass on to the group anything which I criticize and which they don't like. I wrote to the presidents of the Society for Music and Research and asked her to discuss this and tell the women to return to free speech, but I never received a reply. I cannot send anything anymore which includes the trans subject. Fancy free speech being forbidden at a university. I have no chance to explain my opinion anymore, which I find very sad and really awful. Back to my colleague who thinks that the dissolution of women gender norms can improve the secondary state of women in society. Of course, that is ridiculous, because the secondary state of women will not disappear. Why should it? Because people suddenly claim that they are non-binary? The traces of sex cannot be obliterated, and their behavior will not change if they suddenly play such a role. I'm willing to talk to people who are convinced of such ideas, yet I am closed down like many others who dared to open their mouth. So I'm nearly finished now. You've been here, you've heard quite enough, but I just want to finish it off. Many have been upset about identity politics, which is now politically fashionable and in vogue. But there is a simple solution to the problem that could pacify both opponents and supporters. I made up the following together with Alice Schwarzer. She's a very well-known feminist who has her own magazine called Emma, and we agreed on this. I will read it out to you. The mistake people are making today is that they want to dissolve the sexes biologically. But what we need to abolish is what we think of female or male today, not the genders. Men must learn to be more sensitive, to listen, not to see themselves as the primary gender, and thus exercise power. Women need to learn to become more self-confident, to assert themselves, and not constantly subordinate themselves to male domination. This is how things could work out. So we have to abolish what we think of as female or male, the gender roles, and not the biological genders. These are and remain unchangeable. That's the quotation. I can close with a positive ending to my talk by telling you two facts. First, I am working on a book with a title, From Women's Studies to Gender Dissolution, 50 Years of Gender Studies in Music, 1976 to 2026. So I have to finish it by next July, which makes me very busy. In the last chapter, I will show the disadvantages of trying to stamp out biological sex for women and underline that the only way of changing the disadvantages that women still experience is by talking to young people through education, information, pointing to all facts of biology, shedding light on important facts, telling them to ask questions, and discussing everything with them. In that, I agree with Helen Pluckrose and James Lindsay, who talk about the subject in their excellent book, Cynical Theories. I am all for the sexes to move towards one another, of course, but we must make clear that there is no point in pretending one is a member of the opposite sex. Secondly, my deceased partner, Marianne, left money behind meant for the promotion of women's rights, and I would suggest you host a conference in London to which I can contribute some money. No huge sums, but money. Women who think that binary ideas are positive should also be invited so that a thorough discussion can be made possible. We don't just want to praise ourselves. We want to speak to the women who are convinced of the other position and try to get into a discussion. We need a new commitment to freedom of speech shared by all in a secular, liberal democracy. I have now finished my paper. Don't forget, fight for free speech and don't let yourself be intimidated. And thank you for listening.
Now I'm going to introduce Samantha Brown, who is currently our country contact for Canada, and she's going to talk to us about the Bill 663 in Canada, which I have here, that is an online, it's an act to enact the Online Harms Act, to amend the Criminal Code, the Canadian Human Rights Act, and an act respecting the mandatory reporting of internet child pornography. So this is a very huge issue, any amendment to all those acts. So please, Sam, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk a lot about Bill C-63, but I'm also just going to give some updates generally about the increasingly dire situation for women and girls with respect to gender ideology in Canada. So with respect to Canada, I'm afraid, as usual, I don't have very good news to report. I feel that's always the case. But there are always some little pieces of light shining through, especially because of all the strong women here that are fighting. So I'm going to take you through the proposed legislation, Bill C-63, as I said, which is being referred to as the Online Harms Act. I'm also going to talk a bit about Canada's appearance at the 89th CEDAW Convention and about a few other things that have taken place in Canada recently. So with regards to Bill C-63, this is what I've gathered about this bill by reading it in full, watching debates in the House of Commons, and listening to news coverage and political commentators from both sides. The first thing to know about this bill is that it is a Trojan horse bill. There's no question. The bill purports to protect children from online predators, but in reality, it's going to redefine the meaning of hate speech and hate crime and increase penalties for such offenses, both online and offline. So you can see here in the summary of the bill from the Government of Canada's website that they start with protecting children from online predators, and with a plan to stop the spread of child sex abuse materials. And then sandwiched in between those two widely agreed upon issues is the part about amending the criminal code to create a definition for a new definition, for hate crimes and steepen the punishment for such crimes, and to amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to allow for recourse against those who would post hate speech on social media platforms. By piggybacking a much contested issue onto a widely accepted issue, they managed to bamboozle the citizens of Canada quite effectively, just as they did with Bill C-4, which was the conversion therapy bill in January of 2022. During the recent debate on this bill in the House of Commons, Liberal MP Kevin Lemereau carried on about the Conservatives' unwillingness to protect children. He went on and on about the fact that those who oppose this bill consistently say they want to protect children, but now that they've been given an opportunity to do so, they refuse. He also suggested that anyone who opposes this bill is a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist or is part of the far-right MAGA component of the Conservative Party. It's very manipulative, but sadly not remotely surprising. So not remotely surprising, especially considering that they tried to table legislation that would trample on our charter rights in the name of protecting marginalized communities in 2021. You can hopefully see here, and I apologize for the small lettering, the bill was put forward to enact the same changes in C-63 without the addition of child protection. And without that child protection Trojan horse to get it through the gate, Bill C-36 died after its first reading, in my opinion, due to its authoritarian nature. So Bill C-63 would expand the definition of hate speech to include detestation and vilification. Considering the fact that the Canadian government is made up largely of cheerleaders for all things trans, I have absolutely zero doubt that TERFs attempting to spread awareness of, for instance, the reality of autogynephilia or the propensity of trans-identified men to commit violence would be guilty of hate speech under this definition. Even attempting to protect school children from being indoctrinated into the rainbow cult sparked a nationwide No Space for Hate campaign. You can see the logo there in the bottom right in 2023. Calling any pushback on gender ideology, it's not unique to Canada, as we all know, but I really feel that we're going above and beyond here in Canada, tabling legislation that could land a person in prison for such pushback. So if you're guilty, as many women are in Canada are, of posting content that is deemed hateful online and are reported by an individual who fears you may do so again, a judge could issue a peace bond on you. You could be put on house arrest, forced to wear a tracking device, or be prohibited from owning weapons or partaking in drugs or alcohol. And failure to adhere to those peace bonds could land you in prison for up to 4 years. They're also imposing punishments for what they call hate propaganda. And one has to wonder if the stickers and postcards sold by COSBAR, Canadian Women's Sex-Based Rights, and soon to be sold by WDI Canada, that are then distributed by gender critical women in Canada, will fall under this category. Finally, the bill would allow anonymous complainants to report content they deem to be hate speech directed at them specifically. And if it's determined by the new Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that it does indeed fit the description of hate speech, the defendant could be made to pay up to $20,000 to the complainant themselves and up to $50,000 to the receiver general. Anyone who knows the first thing about TRAs knows they will jump at the opportunity to hurt women who refuse to comply or shut up. One of the most concerning things about the bill is the vagueness regarding the punishments and prison sentences, including lifelong sentences. When questioned during a debate on the bill a few weeks ago in the House of Commons, about whether or not this bill would see people who commit minor offenses being sentenced to time in prison, the response was that judges can be trusted not to be too heavy-handed with sentencing. This is quite unsettling, as the Canadian courts are stacked with woke ideologues. And the Justice Centre for Constitutional Freedoms warned that this bill is, quote, the most aggressive assault on free speech in modern Canadian history. Our captured mainstream media paints a very different picture, manipulating Canadians by using the suicide of a young girl to push the idea that we need this bill passed.
Internet safety is a subject talked about in most households, especially with vulnerable family members, young kids, or seniors. The Liberal government is hoping its long-promised online harms bill will help protect people. The latest version is set to be introduced tomorrow. CTV's Colton Braille reports.
More than a decade after Amanda Todd took her own life after online exploitation and bullying, her mother hopes new legislation will help protect children and spare families the grief she's had to endure.
I felt like a failure as a parent because I couldn't do anything. This is why something needs to be done and to make it easier.
The Liberals' long-awaited online harms bill will be introduced Monday, the latest in a series of sweeping and controversial internet regulations.
We need to make sure, and I think we can all agree, we need to protect our kids online.
The proposed bill is aimed at online companies and expected to target hate speech, terrorist content, child exploitation, and the sharing of non-consensual images, both real and AI generated, all with a significant focus on child safety.
And these are large companies, none of which are based in Canada, and we have to have some teeth to be able to compel action, or we'll just be ignored, basically.
The Conservatives say it's an attempt to censor Canadians, while others hope for even stronger digital protections than those expected in the bill.
So this is the kind of coverage that the average Canadian is being exposed to about C63. It sends the message that only a monster who doesn't care about children committing suicide would oppose this bill. And you'll notice that there was a very tiny spot there that said the Conservatives are worried this will censor Canadians, with no description as to why they're saying this or anything. So that is very much the standard coverage that they're seeing. Canada, rather, made an appearance at the 89th CEDAW convention in mid-October. Anyone who would like to watch the convention themselves can find it by going to the UN Web TV and searching CEDAW. And most of the Canadian meetings were covered in meetings 2102 and 2103, which are pictured there. I'll just start by saying that IWRAW, which is the International Women's Rights Action Watch, who were founded to promote recognition of women's human rights under CEDAW, directed organizations that wrote shadow reports to a form that could be filled out to apply for funding to travel and join the convention. Sadly, halfway through filling out this form for WDI Canada, there was a question about whether or not we support trans-identifying men and sex work. The next page made it clear in bolded letters that those who campaign against gender ideology or the sex work industry need not apply for funding due to the fact that we do not share their values. WDI Canada teamed up with COSBAR to submit a shadow report to the UN, as did at least 2 other gender-critical feminist organizations in Canada that I'm aware of, including Vancouver Rape Crisis Center, who had their government funding pulled for refusing to open their center to men. During the several hours of questions and answers, only one expert, Dr. Hacker, brought up shadow reports that had anything to do with self-ID policies. She asked the following question.
And finally, we applaud the efforts of the state party to ensure equality for trans women, including the right to self-identification. But we have received reports that health services providers who decide to offer such services as therapeutic services for cis women who are victimized by males are experiencing severe consequences. What does the state party do to ensure that trans-inclusive policies do not compromise health needs of women who needs only female spaces? Thank you.
So despite the fact that every expert who asked questions was allowed to ask follow-up questions and was given the opportunity to ask again any questions that were not answered, Dr. Hacker's question was ignored. They skipped right past it as if she had never asked it. Aside from that, there was mention of the GBA during the meeting, or the gender-based analysis, which is meant to be a tool to ensure that any policy coming into effect in Canada does not negatively impact women. There was discussions about that being inadequate, as reported in some shadow reports. Sadly, despite the fact that it was brought to the attention of experts in at least one shadow report, ours, there was no mention at all of the fact that the federal government has refused to release the GBA on C-16, which is the bill that put self-ID into effect in Canada. So one of the biggest impacts on Canadian women and girls, the GBA has not been released. Many suspect it wasn't done at all. So that's it's very interesting. And there was, again, no mention of the absence of that that bill being the public being allowed to see that bill at that meeting. There was at one point discussion of the frighteningly high number of femicides occurring in Canada. I was very happy to see that they were discussing such an issue, because there is a woman killed every 2.5 days in Canada. Unfortunately, when the Canadian delegate answered the question, she started by stating, "There is no nationally or internationally understood definition of femicide, but the widely understood definition is the murder of women or gender diverse people." This was a ridiculous thing to say, especially since there has not been a trans-identifying person murdered in Canada in years, and multiple women are murdered here weekly. I found that very insulting to change the definition. And finally, the expert from, I believe, Australia questioned the Canadian delegates on the status of Bill C-63, which I described earlier, and pressed them on pushing this bill through as quickly as possible. The delegate who answered her question assured her that the government has labeled the bill a high priority, and they're moving as swiftly as they can with it. Overall, I can't say I was surprised with the way that the CEDAW convention went, but I had very much hoped that with several shadow reports coming in describing the CEDAW violations with respect to Canadian women's sex-based rights, that there would be at least a few experts who would press them on it. Heather Mason, who is an advocate for women's sex-based rights and more specifically for keeping prisons single-sex in Canada, is raising funds to help pay for the cost of the activism needed to raise awareness of the situation incarcerated women in Canada face since the passing of Bill C-16, which again is the bill that allowed for self-identification in Canada. The funds will be going towards stickers, flyers, banners, protests, and travel expenses. And Heather, this is very interesting, Heather will also be offering honorariums to women who are incarcerated with men who self-identify as women for filling out surveys about their experiences. I'm very thrilled that Heather is doing this. I can tell you from my personal experience, speaking to Canadians in general, and more specifically proponents of self-ID, people are generally, they have no idea that this is happening at all. Certainly not about convicted rapists being jailed with women. I'm also very interested to hear firsthand accounts from the women who have been impacted by this. The last time I looked, Heather has, as you can see there, raised $11,800, which is incredible. If you'd like to contribute to this effort, you can Google search Go Get Funding and select Canadian women's prisons. And staying on the topic of Canadian women's prisons just for a moment, it's been revealed that female prison guards at Leclerc Detention Facility in Laval, Quebec, are being forced to strip search men who self-identify as women at their request. There have been reports of these men requesting female guards to perform searches who then began to, quote, behave in an intimidating and sexually provocative manner during strip searches with the explicit aim of making them feel uncomfortable. Many of these guards staged a 3-hour walkout on August 14th to demonstrate their discomfort in being made to perform strip searches on inmates of the opposite sex. They say this is not something they're trained for and they're uncomfortable with performing this duty, understandably. The government then filed a complaint with the labor court to force them back to work. According to the labor court, quote, the concerted action taken on the 14th of August has harmed or is likely to be prejudicial to a service to which the population is entitled. The tribunal therefore orders the trade union of peace officers to inform its members that they must not cease in a concerted manner to cease working during their shift and that they must provide their work as usual in accordance with their obligations. So in short, women are being forced to strip search men who are being lewd and deliberately making them feel uncomfortable by being overtly sexual. And yeah, the women are just being forced to do this as part of their jobs. Unsurprisingly, our Canadian mainstream media has not covered this at all. Our BC coordinator, Nina, was approached by Allison from Speak Free BC to create a BC election survey project. A 3-woman committee formed and a questionnaire was sent out to BC politicians to determine their stance on women's sex-based rights. The responses that were received were sadly unsurprising, with every progressive MP clutching their pearls at the thought of men in dresses being told to stay out of women's spaces, and the ultra conservatives and some independents supporting women's sex-based rights. Allison wrote about the survey and the results on her Substack, which you can see at Speak Free BC. WDI Canada will soon be launching a store. Some of the items that we'll be selling can be seen here. The 4 designs on the left are some of the stickers that we'll be selling. There will also be t-shirts that are pictured there, as well as other designs. And on the far right is the far right. On the right-hand side is the front of our postcard. The back is going to feature the 9 articles of the declaration with an invitation to visit the website and sign the declaration. Again, we're not quite ready yet. We're almost there, and I wanted to just share with you some of the items we'll be selling to raise funds and continue our advocacy efforts here in Canada. So Canada's aiming to make it clear throughout Canada and indeed the world that Canadian women are true, north, strong, and female. I did just want to make one last note that there will be a protest on November 1st at the German embassy in Ottawa against self-ID coming into force in Germany. If you are in or near Ottawa, please join us from 11:30 to 1:30. Again, it will be at the German embassy. There will also be protests in Montreal and Vancouver at the German consulates. If you'd like to attend, please email me at canada@womensdeclaration.org or message me on Twitter at WDI Canada.
We're going to hear from Kerry Bruss, WDI country contact for the USA, and Megan Blake, WDI country contact for Australia, with a week report.
First, I'm pleased to report that WDI USA is organizing 2 back-to-back events to take place next month in Seattle, Washington, as oral arguments are heard in the case of Olympus Spa et al. Versus Armstrong. This case, currently before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and for which WDI USA filed an amicus brief, centers on whether a female-only nude spa in Washington state can exclude men. The first event is a panel discussion to be held at the Seattle Public Library Auditorium on Sunday evening, November 17th, and will feature Kara Dansky, Amos Sousa, April Morrow, and others speaking out against gender identity ideology and its harmful impacts in the state. The goal for this panel is to bring attention and support to the Olympus Spa case being heard the following day. The second event is a rally on the front steps of the William K. Nakamura Courthouse on Monday morning, November 18th, directly following the oral arguments. Advanced registration is required to attend the library panel, but not the rally at the courthouse. On Thursday, we circulated an email encouraging interested signatories to attend the events and also broadcast a graphic promoting them on our social media channels. Next, Kara alerted me to an article published this morning in the Washington Post decrying the fact that Trump and other GOP candidates are pouring millions into what the Post characterizes as attack ads, tying Democrats to trans rights in swing states as part of their final pitch to persuadable voters before the November 5th election. The piece suggests that the tactic will fail for a variety of reasons, even as it acknowledges there are signs that the ads have Democrats on the defensive. Kara responded to the article by submitting an excellent comment, which was published, which reads, "Feminists have been telling the Democrats in power how their embrace of gender identity harms women and girls since at least August of 2016. When the Women's Liberation Front sued the Obama administration for redefining sex to include gender identity under Title IX. A radical feminist lesbian explained to the Democrat majority House Judiciary Committee live and in person on C-SPAN in April of 2019. The U.S. chapter of Women's Declaration International has been explaining this in no uncertain terms since 2020. It goes on and on and on, basically saying how they're just being ignored. And in August, she published an open letter to Kamala Harris asking her to say at the DNC that a woman is an adult human female. She didn't. Quoting again, rank and file Democrats, including many lesbians and gay men, have been screaming about this for years. The WDI USA Lesbian, Black Women's, and Detransitioned Women's caucuses have spelled out their critiques of gender identity clearly, and she provides a link. I personally know lifelong Democrats who are voting for Trump for this reason, among others. The Democrats in power have ignored our pleas. They are perfectly happy to sacrifice women and girls at the altar of gender identity, and this Republican onslaught of ads is the inevitable result. Women are female and men are male. It's not complicated. Signed, a lifelong registered Democratic adult human female. In a new legal development out of Texas, Attorney General Ken Paxton has filed a suit against the University of Texas Southwestern pediatrician Dr. Mei C. Lau, alleging she violated state law by prescribing at least 21 minor females testosterone after the state's ban of the medicalization of minors went into effect in September of 2023. The suit also alleges that Dr. Lau deceptively prescribed puberty blockers by entering a billing code of an endocrine disorder not otherwise specified, rather than a code for gender dysphoria, which the suit asserts is a violation of the statute prohibiting false, misleading, or deceptive acts of practices in the conduct of any trade or commerce. The AG described the suit as the state's first enforcement action under the new law. The suit seeks over $1 million in civil penalties, attorney's fees, litigation expenses, restitution, and costs. And last but not least, in yet another exclusive, Redux reveals that the father and custodial parent of Maël Jacques, the male athlete who has accumulated multiple titles in girls' high school track in the state of New Hampshire, has been sentenced to 60 months in federal prison for the distribution of child pornography. Mark Jacques first came to the attention of federal authorities in February of 2022 when they began investigating a number of reports made through CyberTip, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children's centralized reporting system, by Kik Messenger, a freeware messaging platform notorious for facilitating child sexual abuse. Kik reported that in November and December of 2021, a Kik user going by the username Wayne9985 uploaded 49 files to other Kik users via private chat messages that appeared to depict child sexual abuse material. Further investigation revealed that between 2018 and 2022, Jacques' residential IP address in Newbury, New Hampshire, was reported in more than 40 cyber tips. Upon examination of his electronic devices, Jacques was found to have stored over 200 files containing child pornography. In one of the videos described by prosecutors, a female child was seen being orally raped. Unsurprisingly, Jacques, as well as both of his sons, wrote letters to the court requesting that he receive probation in lieu of a prison sentence in order that he might continue his trans advocacy work. Sentencing occurred on September 9th, though Jacques is being allowed to remain free until December 2nd, when he is expected to surrender himself to federal custody. And that's all I have today. Thank you.
In Australia, the New South Wales Omnibus Equality Bill passed Parliament on the 17th of October. It passed the lower house in the morning after the Premier announced his support for it at the opening of a preschool. The second reading speech was conducted in the upper house at 3:02 p.m. and then it passed without amendment at 8:30 p.m. This is a very large omnibus bill that covers a whole range of topics, from changing birth certificates on effectively self-ID through prostitution, surrogacy, the ability of prison inmates to access gender-affirming medicine, etc., etc. No committee stage was held in the upper house. The results from the lower house committee, that the public largely rejected many of the gender aspects, were not fully acted on. Some amendments were made in the passage through the lower house, so the passed bill is not exactly the same as the first draft. For instance, the ability of 16-year-old children and 17-year-old children to change their birth certificates, the sex and name on their birth certificates, without parent knowledge was removed. The right to gender-affirming medicine was dropped. Street prostitution was not in the end fully decriminalised, and some protections against discrimination in schools and workplaces were dropped. The largely self-ID change of birth certificates remains, along with recognition of parentage in overseas surrogacy purchases, among other things. Some members of Parliament made excellent speeches against the bill. Rachel Wong from Women's Forum Australia has extracted I think all of them, and posted them on x.com if you want to go to her page and view them, share them, support the members of Parliament who supported women. Meanwhile, Libby Mettam, leader of the Western Australian Liberal Party, has promised to repeal the Western Australian legislation on birth certificate changes that was passed earlier this year if they are elected to government. The next WA election is coming up in March next year. Doctors and medical scientists, including fairly well-known ones like TJ Jack Martin, Emeritus Professor of Medicine at the University of Melbourne, they have signed an open letter so far from close to 50 doctors, including paediatricians and child and adolescent psychiatrists, that's critical of a government evidence check, it was called, published in September, that's been used to justify the expansion of child gender affirmation clinics in New South Wales against the Cass report findings. The letter has been launched by GenSpect Australia, and I'll put links to both it and the evidence check that they're saying is flawed. Dr. Gillian Spencer, child psychiatrist, is one signatory. She's currently involved in her own legal proceedings over her dismissal from a Queensland hospital due to her refusal to uncritically affirm children patients. Her trial date is not yet set, but we'll keep an eye on that. The ABC, the Australian national broadcaster, is running a survey to ask women for their views on women's sports, including whether men should compete with women. They have defined women in the survey as women, non-binary, and gender diverse athletes, including trans women. So they're basically asking everyone for their views on women's sports. ABC Sport and Deakin University have partnered to produce it, and it's based on the BBC's Elite British Sportswomen Study. So I'll put a link to it in the chat. You can also email them a submission, and hopefully the number of women responding to them will be greater than the number of non-women. Gaynor and the Minister for Communications was determined by the Federal Court on the 14th of October. This was a man who challenged the classification of the book Genderqueer as unrestricted, so he said it was not appropriate for children. The court determined that the board did in fact ignore, overlook or misunderstand relevant material. The Gaynor alleged that the book depicted and promoted pedophilia, which was a pretty fair description of it. The board received public submissions, but it ignored them because it said they were overwhelmingly anti-LGBTQIA+. And when the court looked at it, they found that only maybe 11% of the submissions by number, so less than 1% of the people who actually responded, could possibly be described in that way. So that's not overwhelmingly. And they ignored other things like the depiction of a sexual relationship between a teacher and a student. So the decision of the board has been quashed, and it's been directed to reassess the book in light of the proper principles determined by the court. And lastly, the matter between Member of Parliament, Victorian Parliament Moira Deeming, and Leader of the State Opposition John Pesutto continues. That's the defamation matter in connection with her organising and attendance at the Let Women Speak rally last year. It's been going for a few weeks now, and closing arguments are currently underway. We're expecting a judgment faster than the usual timeline in December. The Tribunal Tweets page on the case is fantastic. So if you're not able to watch the live stream because they take it down as soon as court closes each day, then you can have a look at the Tribunal Tweets page. Thank you.